But when your sex education is either an uneducated partner, Hollywood, music, porn, right? Or a school system that really doesn't tell you about any external genitalia. I remember and again, I went to Catholic school, but I remember the female organs were ovaries and uterus in my sex ed. And it's like that has very little to do with pleasure and, functioning. It's like, let me figure out where my ovaries are so I can be sexually active. It doesn't even make any sense, right? And so it's like so much of our education is kind of glommed together by this just like C-level education system. And then we feel like we're broken because we're not living up to like the Hollywood ideals.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the channel, or welcome to the channel if you're new here. We have the amazing Dr. Kelly Casperson. Dr. Casperson is a urologist. She is an author of You Are Not Broken, which is also a top international podcast. She's an amazing speaker who just did a TEDx talk and a sex educator. So there's a lot of things I missed. You're doing all the things on a tremendous mission here. Kelly, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me on. It's so fun.
Yeah. And just for anyone who hasn't met you yet, of course they need to, but if they haven't met you yet, can you share a little bit about who you are?
Yeah, so I'm a urologist. Went to med school, did 6 years of urology training. I'm in private practice in Washington State. I had a patient who changed my life. She was basically crying in my office about sexual health issues, and I didn't know how to help her. And it's right at that like 7 years in your career, the 7-year itch, where like you're ready. Like the universe is like, you ready? Because you're kind of bored, right? And then I was like, is it true we don't know anything about women's sexual health? Is it true the gynes should be handling all this? And I just started learning, and like it's amazing how much of an expert you can be if you just dedicate yourself to like reading all the things. And a voice in my head told me I needed to talk, and the voice didn't shut up until I started a podcast. And that was 3.5 years ago. And I was #2 in sexuality on Apple last week. So it's growing. It's amazing. I do a lot of hormone education too, because of sex, basically, because women are like, yeah, but because of hormones,
Yeah.
sex.
Yeah.
And I'm like, I don't know, because of hormone sex. What? And I like went into because as doctors, we know how to do the research. We can get behind the firewall, the paywall, right? And read the journal articles. And I was like, well, that's not true either. There as much mystery and shame as there is about sex, there's a whole bunch of the same crap about hormones. So now I'm kind of a hormone expert too. Kind of a hormone expert. I'm like humble bragging, but I'm like, yeah, I do hormones too.
Yeah. And I watch your Instagram a lot. So of course I'm going to share that in the show notes where they can find you on Instagram. I'm learning a lot. And it's funny, I'm learning a lot as a female also in medicine, that realize like what you say in your book here, again, if people haven't seen it yet, You Are Not Broken, make sure to grab it. Okay. First of all, it's very educational, but your personality comes out and it's awesome to read, creating the safe space for a topic that can be challenging for people. And I love how you talk about that at the beginning, because for me, who has resistance about the topic, and that you've helped create that safe space for me to lean in and get curious about where that came from. When you hear about sex, in our culture, it's often portrayed as very objectifying. We know porn portrays it in a way that it's very oppressive towards women often. And for me, it just created this really challenging relationship with intimacy in my own body. And when you talk about being raised in a religion where it might be taboo, and it's so important that we have all of these beliefs that have become normalized in our head, and to at least, if people aren't ready to buy in and lean in all the way, so like I'm going to jump in and learn everything about that, but get curious about where did my thoughts stem from and what's the cost of not challenging them.
Yes. Oh, it's huge. I mean, and that was kind of like my journey of I got into coaching because of sex, right? And the coaching is really where they challenge you to challenge your thoughts, right? And like, is that thought serving you, or is that thought not serving you? And like, maybe you didn't even put that thought in your head. Maybe society put it in there. And certainly the lack of sex education in this country, in the world, um, is worse now than it was in the 90s. We have data to show that, right? So it's not getting any better. But when your sex education is either an uneducated partner, Hollywood, music, porn, right? Or a school system that really doesn't tell you about any external genitalia. I remember and again, I went to Catholic school, but I remember the female organs were ovaries and uterus in my sex ed. And it's like that has very little to do with pleasure and, functioning. It's like, let me figure out where my ovaries are so I can be sexually active. It doesn't even make any sense, right? And so it's like so much of our education is kind of glommed together by this just like C-level education system. And then we feel like we're broken because we're not living up to like the Hollywood ideals, right? And so to really to think about our thoughts is like, maybe I'm not operating with like a great education here, and education is so empowering. I was just posting on Instagram like yesterday of like, my job's to give you the education. You get to decide what to do with it, right? I don't care if you have sex or not. I don't care, I just want you to have the education and the knowledge. Then you get to have your own journey. And it's so cool.
Yeah, so something I was coming up when we were talking about sex ed, I had my period for 2 years before I shared it with my mom because we didn't talk about that. And I was very much tomboy and was early developer, which was, I don't know if traumatic's the right word for it, but as a fifth grader developing before your peers and having comments made to me, it imprinted on my head a lot of shame and a lot of wanting to get small and reduce my feminine characteristics. So it's kind of like doing some healing of my childhood self when I relearn and open up. And I know I'm not alone in these conversations. So I wanted to just bring that up as something like, again, get curious. And even in your book, you talk about, sometimes it's important to, as you're leaning into this, to get the support of a therapist because a lot might come up.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think a lot for a lot of adults is like becoming the parent, like how to parent yourself, like, and really becoming that parent that you needed. If you didn't have that love and acceptance, is like, I can give that love and acceptance to myself now. And kind of that like self-parenting thing, which I mean, I'm trained as a surgeon. That was like so woo to me, like even 3 years ago. And now I'm like, we become who we need to become to heal ourselves. And
Yeah.
it can be very, very awesome.
And with the surgeon mentality. So I started off on the surgery path. I was an oral surgeon for resident for 3 years. And I thought in order to become mentally tough, we had to break ourselves down. And with somebody who's had a severe eating disorder, a lot of body dysmorphia, I realized like, okay, well, I was internalizing a lot of when I was going through surgery, a lot of that negative self-talk. So I think, whether people are sexually active with other people or not, I think what your information, your education allows us is to reconnect with our body in a compassionate way. And when we develop compassion for our body, we won't let other people abuse it. And I think that's why it's important to have this information for ourselves to pass it down to our kids, because I wish I had that, like, your body is your own temple, like you have agency over this. You're not just there to serve a partner.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. I agree. And like, I have two girls now, and it's like they get me having done all this work, and so it's like their sex education is going to be so different than what I got of like, your pleasure is as important. Nobody's allowed to use you for their pleasure. Like, it's a pleasure together, and it's a discussion before that happens. And just like this empowerment that I want to instill on them. I see so many people like coming from the Catholic background of like, sex is an obligation, sex is kind of like, written in the marriage contract or something, of like this thing you do for other people. And in our society, where especially women are so strapped for any time for self-care, self-love, doing anything for themselves, it's just another thing to do for somebody else. And to really kind of reframe it of like, this is for you. This experience is your experience. You may choose to share it with another person. And how do we communicate that when we've been socialized that it's not about you, it's for other people? And really kind of starting to think about it that way.
yeah, and I was comparing, feedback in just in society how we talk about things. Right? Your patient, as I understand it, was had complications from radiation, and it was affecting her sex life. And is that correct with the
Yeah,
patient?
we'll call her Susie. Susie had surgery.
Oh,
Uh,
okay.
so hers was surgical, but certainly, like, just with aging and with hormone changes and with not knowing how to communicate, right? And it's like all these things add up in everybody, of like, sometimes it's one thing, but sometimes it's kind of all these things that kind of pile up to be like, oh yeah, we used to be sexual and now we're not. And we don't really understand how we got there. It's just kind of slowly happens. Again, I'm not here to say everybody needs to have sex,
Yeah.
but what I really think, what I love this topic is like learning to communicate difficult things, learning to feel your feelings, learning to learn and challenge things. We've like all these are all just life skills, and it's like the ultimate personal growth of like using just sexuality as like the conduit for personal growth. So I think even people who don't have big sex goals can learn a lot by thinking about these topics.
Yeah. And even just if it is someone's priority, as comparing being, so I work in head and neck cancer. People will come to us and tell us all their symptoms. But I also do oral medicine, and some of the lesions have impacts on the vagina, and those, they might not, say that they also have lesions there. So it's just helping people to advocate for themselves by normalizing this type of discussion.
Yeah, I was just podcasting with somebody. We're like, down there is not a body part,
Down,
and
sorry, is that what I said? No.
no,
I
no,
don't.
no, no. Just for like for other people of like
Oh,
why you need to be empowered about your body is because if you go to a provider and you say it hurts down there, like, and even I would challenge if they actually name a body part to like have them point to it, it's usually not the wrong body part. Like our education's so bad. And what do doctors do? We just give you antibiotics for anything down there, right? And so it's really like when your ear hurts, doctors look at your ear, right? When your elbow hurts, doctors look at your elbow. Nobody's looking down there. We don't know the words. We don't know how to examine it. And like people suffer.
yeah.
So yeah, even empowerment of like, even if you're not sexually active, just empowerment about your body, because there are things that can happen that can be fixed.
Yeah. And it's interesting. So what kind of things, if people are just getting started, what's a more common type of topic that people usually start off with?
Like a complaint in clinic or like
Yeah.
sexual.
Just just sex ed when it comes to, because you had your TEDx talk of why we need adult sex ed. So I'm curious, like, obviously we just showed that we don't talk about it enough, but
Yeah.
when people are given these tools, what's kind of like the first thing, or I would say more of the sex ed 101 that they could maybe take a first step to gain benefit from?
Understanding genital urinary syndrome of menopause, because it's common and it's very treatable. And like again, our education on what menopause is so freaking crappy. We just think it was like a hot flash and then it's done. Like that would say that's the stereotypical amount of menopause knowledge that people have. And what they don't understand is when estrogen goes down, they get 50 to 80% of people get genital urinary syndrome of menopause, which is dry vagina, dry vulva, pain with sex, pain with entry, decreased ability to have arousal and orgasm. Like there's all this sexual part of it because the genital structures are affected by low estrogen, but it's also urinary tract infections, urinary frequency, urgency, urinary leakage. Like it's all of these other itching, so it's all these other things too that are because of low estrogen. And I see so many people that number one, they, don't know that this is a menopause thing. And they stopped having sex like 7 years ago because it hurt. And they didn't talk to anybody about it. They didn't do anything about it. They weren't curious about it. They just kind of accepted it as a new normal and didn't know it was like a thing that's easily treated.
Yeah, and I think there's normalization of just, well, I'm such and such an age, so our sex life is over.
Yeah. Well, I just did a podcast episode with a 73-year-old who's happily sexually active. She will disagree with that myth
Yeah.
significantly. Yeah. But again, it's our sex ed, right? Like we don't do a good job, we being like America, I guess, don't the world, of normalizing sexuality for all genders, people who have disabilities, old people, all these marginalized groups that if you don't fit within this like beautiful narrative, sex isn't for you. And we're not told that like explicitly, but we kind of all know that, right? And it's really the miseducation of like all humans are sexual beings. Small group of asexuality people, excluding that, which we think is about 1 to 2%.
Yeah,
Um,
I was thinking about that because I was telling you I had a hypothalamic amenorrhea and lack of hormones, and like of course with like depression and like there's zero interest. It's like it's kind of confounding, right? There's so many things, and not to say it's not true, but I'm just curious like how many times that all was considered when it comes to asexuality, or when, it's just I think getting to know ourselves and leaning into that, because I also think the trauma of sexual assault or things from our past, and this is why I advocate for people, if they're leaning in and have that, to get help with a therapist that's they feel safe and comfortable with, because that to me would shut down any interest.
mhm. Yeah, well, and then especially if you've never had sex worth desiring, which I talk a lot about in the book of like if you're just spoon-fed chicken every single time you go to the restaurant, boiled chicken, you're like, I don't like going to restaurants. You're like, did you know there was like a whole freaking menu? You have spaghetti. People are like, what? Like, I can't even conceive spaghetti. I've just been given chicken my whole life. Hollywood's showing chicken. All of my partners have given me chicken. Like, what do you mean there's spaghetti? Right? Of like, if there's only a certain type of thing going on, like, you have no idea that you would be enjoying like ribeye.
Yeah.
But you
Yeah.
just, you normalize it like that of like if the only exercise you were allowed to do was like to run a marathon, you're like, I'm not a person who exercises.
Yeah, I get that a lot because I do run marathons, and people, and this is similar, right? The oppression of women and like I think diet culture is very oppressing, usually. And so people that talk to me always want to learn how to run, but when I ask them why, it's because it's weight loss and changing their body in some way. When it comes to your why and what fuels you, and telling us more about, this became such a passion and it's changing so many lives.
It's education for me is like the gift I've been given for having been able to go to med school, for having been able to become a surgeon, for having been able to understand the pelvis and what happens with menopause, and then my ability to be able to share that, right? And usually very like either poignant or no BS ways or funny ways of like I'm pretty good at communicating it. And now I can't stop because people reach out to me, all genders reach out to me. The men are like, my marriage has been changed because of you. We're actually talking about this. We're actually doing something about our troubles because of you. The amount of people who are like, because of you, I talked to my doctor about this. I got a prescription because of this. I tried this. I feel so much better. I've gotten out of bed because of you. Like over and over and over. I get like the occasional hater, and you're like, I'm gonna stop this. I can't handle this. And then you're like, yeah, it's so rare though. It's so rare. Anybody, you can't disagree with me, right? I'm mostly like, get educated and do what you want with it. I'm not telling you how to live your life. I'm
Yeah.
making suggestions, but it's 99.7% rewarding with like amazing feedback all the time.
Yeah, and I always think for the feedback that we get, if it's resistance, like I shared, because there will be people that are feeling resistance, but that's an inward curiosity that needs to happen. Like if I'm going to project on you, like, oh, stop it, it's too much. But why? Like getting curious. And like you said, I'm not going to force people to have sex. And I often think even the first thing should be get to know yourself, your body, that body part that we don't talk about, which is the clitoris. Like, where is it?
Clitoris
I
is
don't know. What is this thing? I don't.
it is erased, man. Like you can't say it on Instagram. You can't show pictures of it on the internet. Like our society has literally put a black box around a body part that like changes with hormones, can have, phimosis and tight skin that causes pain with schmegma. Like there are clitoris medical issues. Nobody knows about that, right? We just get taught where in Hollywood do they ever say that the clitoris is important? And that's where I think a lot of people get sex ed.
Yeah.
I was blown away. And so much of this is like, if I'm blown away, having done like 6 years of pelvic surgery training and medical school, if I'm blown away that like, did you know only 30% of women will orgasm with penetrative vaginal intercourse? 30%. And I'm like, what's everybody doing? They're eating chicken at the same restaurant all the time and like thinking they just don't like restaurants. But I'm like blown away by that statistic. I'm blown away by the orgasmic inequality statistics. Like the people having the most amount of orgasms in any relationship is heterosexual men. Again, I say this in my TED Talk. Shockingly, they're paired with the people having the least amount of orgasms, the heterosexual female, right? Like I'm blown away by that stuff. And I'm like, if I'm blown away, probably everybody else thinks this is pretty interesting too.
Yeah. And so I had the opportunity to hear you talk first at the ACE conference. And I just found, were you always a badass speaker? Or tell us a little bit more. Your way of communicating, it is so captivating. And you explain things that are usually really hard for, people become very, like, even if it was in a research article, that's dry and people, like you said, can't access it. It's behind a paywall, but you are so captivating. So have you always been that way?
I think it's been a lot of practice. As physicians, right? Like you've been giving grand rounds and M&M and teaching stuff for like how many years, right? And you get to the point of like caring about, how many boring conferences have you gone to now, right? And like,
Yeah.
especially with our attention span with social media, like you got to be keeping people's attention or they're going to jump on their phone in like 2 minutes, right? Nothing teaches you that more than like learning to do a TED Talk where they're like, you have 12 minutes, kill
Yeah.
all your darlings, right?
Yeah.
So to me, it's just like, I love the topic, which really helps.
Yeah.
But I also think I have some sort of genetic disorder because my grandfather was in radio, my mom was on stage, just kind of in our community. My brother has a top podcast too. So I think there is some sort of like, I can't say it's all like from me. I have some like, there's some gene in there that just wants to communicate with people.
That's so funny. I would like to usually write it down and hand deliver it to people. And I think it's like, okay, well, when you're so passionate about your why, you have to often speak it because like the attention span you just said, people aren't going to read my blogs or my blog length emails. And you just, but anyways, on that note, you have so many ways that people can grab this information and you meet people where they're at. And I'd love to go over all the ways that people can connect with you.
Yeah, totally. Website's kellycaspersonmd.com. TED Talk is Kelly Casperson TEDx. I think it'll pop up. I'm wearing an awesome red dress. I love Instagram. Instagram's probably my favorite. That's Kelly Casperson MD. Facebook is You Are Not Broken. Um, I have an online course for sex ed. You can go through at your own pace, short videos, because again, we want solutions quickly. We want some education fast. So that is not hours and hours of content. That is like quick, the sex ed you never got. So that's a nice short course for people. And then there's the monthly membership where you can actually listen to me do the podcast and then you get me live for like coaching and education once a month. So to me, because it's like, I don't need to be everybody's doctor, nor can I be everybody's doctor. Sometimes people just need a little bit of education and they're off and running. So it's really however you want to access it. I wrote the book because I love reading. And I'm like, oh, not everybody likes listening to podcasts, right?
Yeah.
So if they don't want that, let's put it in a book. There'll be a second book coming out. I'm just signing the like contract for it. And that's going to be more like same style, but more about like midlife menopause empowerment. I think so many people, again, society tells you, right? Society tells you what they think about women of a certain age. And it's like, what if we didn't have that? What if you just realize you're only halfway through, right?
Yeah.
What if you realized you get to drive your own life? Stop waiting around for other people to like tell you what to do, right? So it's more, the book's going to be more kind of empowerment midlife, a little more hormones, a little more like it's one life, man. If not now, when?
Yeah. And it's like, the arrival fallacy that we talk a lot about, like, oh, okay, so for me, I grew up a lot around people talking about the body image thing. And when it comes to sex, like, oh, well, when I get to this body, then I'll be sexy or whatnot. And like, oh my God, the biggest killer of my hormones was restricting and weight loss and how we can help. Like, I'd love to also support just people really developing a very self-compassionate, positive relationship with their body today, like not when my
Today.
body, because when we want to change our body, like that's negative self-talk, that's actually widening the gap and being so much more confident. And I love the confidence that you exude. I think it's like you're such a great example. So when you pair the example of you, the way that you communicate this information, I highly recommend everybody to follow you on Instagram. It's really impacted my life in such a positive way. So I really,
Thank
really
you.
appreciate you.
I mean, I think for especially for physicians, right, or anybody who's kind of gets in this education system, is we're always waiting for the next whatever, right? Got to get up, wait till college is done so you get to med school, wait till med school's done to get to residency, wait till residency's done to get to be an attending. And I did all that. I was always waiting for the next thing, right? And you get to a point where you're like your only life is today. Like today is your life, not when perfect happens, because that perfect will never happen, or when X, Y, and Z happen. And it finally clicked for me of like, oh, today, and I'm in charge. Nobody's going to come tell you to live the life of your dreams. I was waiting for somebody to tell me that I should start a podcast about women's sexuality. I literally had a plan to
Come
like,
on,
I,
universe. Hey, you
I,
could have called
I
me
know,
and said you're waiting, because then I would have dropped the universe message on your face.
right?
But you got it. You heard it somehow.
I heard it. Well, I mean, it was very cool because I was like, okay, this man is probably who I'm waiting for to call me to tell me I know enough to do this podcast, to be an expert. This is like 3.5 years ago now. And it got out of the shower where like all the ahas happened. And it was like, oh, nobody's coming. You need to give yourself permission. That's who you're waiting for. And it was like, boom. The next, I was like, whatever, the next day or something, I'm like, started the podcast. Oh, I needed my permission. Got it.
Yeah,
And
I
like,
love it.
and from there, you're just like, you just need your own permission to live your life. And it's like so many people, I think, especially people socialized as women, are waiting for permission or waiting for the kids to be this old or waiting for blah, 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 or whatever they're waiting for is like, this is your one go, man. This is your one go. Like, start living your life.
Yeah, that resonates so deeply. So I have a Facebook group called Permission to Pivot. And the reason I created it was because when I was in surgery, I was suicidal for 3 years before I gave myself permission to maybe change course. Maybe potentially. And still I consider going back to finish. And I'm like, okay, wait, maybe you can give yourself permission to lean in to see where your strengths are and where you could add the most value. And it may not be going back and finishing the residency. That's just like an undone unfinished thing. Maybe it's finished for me, but that permission kept coming up and it really resonates with people, like, oh, especially being people pleasers for a really long time.
Yeah. Yeah. And to realize being people pleasers is a very safe thing, right? Like for me, if I was perfect when I was a kid, I was then below the radar, right? Like
Yeah.
I wasn't going to get in trouble. I was not going to be being noticed. Like it was a very safe path. And to be, the other thing I think for people that this might be helpful is like really thanking the younger you that set you up and like had those experiences so you could learn what you needed to learn. So you are where you are right now of like, I'm really grateful for my perfectionist younger self because she got me here, but I don't have to keep carrying that boat for the rest of my adult life.
Yeah, adult life's all about unlearning what we learned that had value and a role in our lives in the past. Like I think a lot, even with people pleasing in my eating disorder, was to keep myself safe, and then it's like, no, it's obviously no longer keeping you safe. So then what? Giving ourselves permission to let that go and grieve the loss of what we leave behind to become who we truly want to be.
Yeah, totally. I was talking to a physician who's almost 80 and he's still like so massively passionate about what he does and what he researches and his education and stuff like that. And I'm like, this guy's almost 80. And it hit me. I'm like, what if I just got started? Like, what if we're just getting started? And it's, and how does that thought make you feel? Right.
Yeah.
like, to me, it makes me feel very energized of like, "Oh my gosh, I did all that just to be started right now."
Yeah.
And it's a very energizing thought for me.
Yeah, and you capture it in your book too because it's an evolving process, right? It's we know that science is constantly evolving and there's all those things that were not only ignored, but we were taught untrue things, right? And so you have to combat the things that weren't true with the internalized belief systems that we have, and then explore new things and trust that you did the best you could at the time that you presented new knowledge. And I think it's, I highly respect people to say, well, this is what it was back then, and this is what it is now, and here's what we've learned since, because we think, like I did growing up, that science was black and white, it was right, and I could just consume it all in a book.
Yeah.
And having a growth mindset has been transformational because then it takes off the pressure. Like for you to start your podcast, well, I have to know absolutely everything. Well, you can't know absolutely everything. Well, I guess I just have to start then.
Yeah, totally. And I see this a lot on social media because this social media like channels this of like, I just want, is it yes or is it no? Is it black or is it white? Are hormones good or is hormones bad? What do I, like and it's like, dude, the nuance of life is just like so much more than that. I see this a lot with people. I've been realizing this, something I don't think doctors pay attention to, of like the average person, when you tell them there's risks to something, they think the risks are going to happen to them.
Yeah.
And I'm like, and I'm just like, the more you're in medicine, the more you're like, oh, I don't think people even understand what risks mean. Right. And so it's like we're kind of operating in this world of like, we don't have basic science knowledge. We don't, we want it yes and no, but the complexities of it are complex. But just because something has risks doesn't mean you're going to have the risks. Right. And so it's really this kind of like baseline science knowledge that I think is lacking. And then you try to have these really complex conversations and you're like, oh, it's a lot. It's a lot more than a 15-minute doctor visit. It's a lot more than an Instagram, reel. And that's why podcasting is so great. And like long form YouTube stuff is so great because it's like you get to have those longer conversations and talk about more nuanced things.
Yeah. And it is, yeah. When I used to extract teeth, I used to have to sell it, and your jaw might fracture. Like even if it was like anterior tooth and a man with very dense bone, your jaw might fracture. It's like something you have to say, and people would really hone in on that. But you think it will? And then there's some people that, like me as a patient, I think so. My heart rate was in the 20s, and I would hear things like, "Oh, you might die," and I wouldn't believe them because we're physicians, and at the time I was, a dental specialist. So I'm like, well, clearly I am not going to have problems with my teeth or my body because I study this, right? Clearly. This is like this flawed belief system is like, it's just like very true to me.
Yeah.
So yeah.
There's this awesome quote in the new Abraham Verghese book, The Covenant of Water. He's a very kind of famous internal medicine doctor that like is this insane writer. I don't know if you've read his books, but in this new novel, he says this thing, and he says physicians make a deal, either with God or the devil, I can't remember which, that if we promise to take care of other people, we will be immune from ourselves getting sick or having disease. And the way he says this like quote, like I felt so incredibly seen, and I think so many physicians like feel seen with that of like, yeah, but it's not going to happen to us because we're like the ones taking care of the other people.
Exactly. That's exactly how I felt. And
Yeah.
there's just like some dissociation. I think when you're just surviving the training system, that people don't realize how traumatic it can be. And I was told one time in treatment, like, you talk about yourself like you're the patient. And I'm like, that's kind of how I had to in order to actually do the things that the patient would need in order to get well. This is I had, but my brain,
Right.
that's how it registered. So
Yeah.
yeah, you shared so many great tidbits. Is there any specific takeaways you want to leave the audience with today?
Oh man, like I think I just saw the statistic of like how few books people read, and like we read fewer books the older we get and the more kind of out of the educational system we get. And it seems to me just like what we prioritize, but also kind of like we get less curious, you know. I've got young kids, they're curious as all get out, right? They're asking all these questions. And there's like this study looking at like how many less questions we ask as we get older. And I think, what something you've said a couple of times and just really resonates with me is like, if you stay curious Your life can be so interesting and so fascinating. There's so many amazing things out there to like learn about and to do. And I think we forget to read and we forget to be curious and like really the joy that that can bring in people's lives.
I love it. And it brings that childlike curiosity that keeps us young.
Totally. They ask so many questions and then we stop. We stop asking questions.
Yeah, I haven't stopped yet. I think I'm an annoying adult, but maybe I've already learned that
You've
lesson.
already learned. You already learned the secret
Yeah.
to
I
having
think
fun.
actually coaching, like you said, it's helped because we all talk about humble inquiry and being curious. And I realized through learning how to coach that curiosity was such an important skill and really could change your life. So thank you for leaving everyone with that. Of course, I agree. And thank you, Kelly, for being here. Really appreciate you.
Thanks for having me.
And of course, if anyone has any questions, you can reach out to Kelly on all of her different platforms or share your questions and comments down below. We appreciate you being here. Until next time.